Interpretation of Punarvasu Nakshatra. When the moon is placed in Punarvasu Nakshatra and supported by benefics like Jupiter or Venus, the emotional landscape becomes nurturing, forgiving, and inherently optimistic. Ruled by Jupiter and symbolized by the return of the light after a storm, Punarvasu grants the capacity for emotional renewal, wisdom, and deep inner contentment. A benefic moon here fosters a calm, grounded mind that bounces back from setbacks with resilience. However, when afflicted by Saturn, Rahu, or Ketu, the moon may struggle with emotional inconsistency, detachment from reality, or repetitive cycles of emotional loss and renewal. Venus in Punarvasu exudes gentle elegance, spiritual sensuality, and an innate sense of beauty that is comforting rather than provocative. A well-placed Venus, especially in Kendra or Kona houses and supported by Jupiter, results in artistic expression that heals, soothes, or reconnects others to hope and grace. However, when afflicted, Venus in Punarvasu may produce romantic disillusionment, over-idealism in love, or retreat into fantasy when emotional expectations are unmet. Jupiter placed in its own nakshatra, Punarvasu, gains strength and spiritual maturity. This is an exalted placement when supported by benefics and placed in angular or trinal houses. The native becomes a teacher, philosopher, or guide, someone capable of inspiring others through compassion and higher understanding. However, if Jupiter is afflicted or placed in Dhisthana houses, the optimism may turn to blind faith, spiritual escapism, or moral superiority cloaked in idealism. Mars in Punarvasu adds drive to the nakshatra's hopeful return energy. When Mars is well placed, the native becomes a protector, reformer, or assertive teacher who leads with emotional intelligence. Punarvasu softens Mars's aggression and channels it into healing, creative action, or community upliftment. But under affliction or in houses like the 6th or 8th, Mars may oscillate between overexertion and guilt, struggling to integrate emotional softness with assertive action. Saturn in Punarvasu tends to bring wisdom through emotional maturity and long-term spiritual discipline. While Saturn's energy may initially suppress Punarvasu's regenerative optimism, if placed well, it provides resilience, faith, and the ability to guide others through hardship. However, when Saturn is weak or afflicted, the native may battle with internal heaviness, delays in emotional healing, or deep-seated fears of abandonment masked under stoic behavior. Rahu in Punarvasu exaggerates the desire for spiritual renewal, ideal relationships, or fame through healing personas. When Rahu is supported by Jupiter or Venus, the native may become a prominent voice in healing, spirituality, or media that uplifts the masses. But when afflicted, Rahu's presence distorts Punarvasu's purity, creating escapism, emotional dependency, or a savior complex that undermines personal stability. Ketu in Punarvasu creates deep past life emotional wisdom. The native often possesses an inborn sense of serenity, spiritual memory, or detachment from material highs and lows. When Ketu is placed in strong houses or supported by benefics, it enhances intuition and resilience, making the native a spiritual counselor or an old soul. But if afflicted, this placement can manifest as emotional stagnation, inability to bond, or detachment from purpose due to unresolved past karma. Mercury in Punarvasu brings a gentle and wise form of communication. The native is often skilled at uplifting speech, writing, or teaching, particularly when supported by Jupiter. In trinal or angular houses, Mercury here expresses emotionally intelligent humor, language for healing, or media that nurtures. However, under malefic influence, Mercury may vacillate between hopeful speech and mental escapism, or become scattered in thought, losing the grounded renewal Punarvasu seeks to offer. Interpretation of Punarvasu Nakshatra, house placement context. When Jupiter, the ruler of Punarvasu Nakshatra, is placed in a Kendra, 1st, 4th, 7th, 10th, or Kona, 1st, 5th, 9th, Punarvasu's essence of restoration, wisdom, and emotional revival finds ideal grounding to flourish. For example, for Cancer ascendant, if Jupiter rules the 6th and 9th houses and is placed in the 1st house, Kendra, and Moon is in Punarvasu, the native embodies a healing, spiritually resonant personality. Punarvasu's nurturing impulse becomes an outward trait, creating educators, counselors, or religious figures whose very presence brings others back to emotional wholeness. If Venus is in Punarvasu and rules the 4th and 11th houses for Leo ascendant, and Venus is placed in the 5th house, Kona, the native may channel beauty, hope, and harmony into creative pursuits, romantic bonds, or child rearing. Venus in Punarvasu in a trinal house supports artistic regeneration, love after disappointment, or community building through aesthetics and kindness. The native often becomes a channel for grace after chaos, using personal charm to uplift others emotionally and socially. When planetary lords of Punarvasu-linked planets are placed in Dushtana houses, 6th, 8th, or 12th, emotional restoration becomes a karmic challenge. Suppose Mercury is in Punarvasu and rules the 2nd and 5th houses for Virgo ascendant, but is placed in the 8th house. The native may suffer communication breakdowns, secrecy, or a need to emotionally reprocess deep intellectual trauma. Punarvasu's regenerative tendency goes inward, producing researchers, spiritual seekers, or those who rebuild identity after betrayal or silence. Now consider Saturn in Punarvasu for Taurus ascendant, ruling the 9th and 10th houses, and placed in the 6th house. This creates a slow and steady healer who reforms through service and repetition. Punarvasu's hope is delayed but eventually fulfilled. The native may face setbacks in education or career, but emerges as a structured problem solver or crisis guide. Saturn's position here tests faith and morality through conflict, service, and spiritual endurance. If Mars is in Punarvasu and rules the 1st and 6th houses for Scorpio ascendant, and is placed in the 9th house, Kona, the native becomes a dharmic warrior, someone who fights for justice, ethics, and truth. Mars gives boldness, and Punarvasu lends the grace to begin again after failure. This combination is excellent for those involved in law, philosophy, or spiritual leadership, particularly when guided by high principles and emotional stability. Suppose Rahu is in Punarvasu and Jupiter, its nakshatra lord, is placed in the 12th house for Gemini ascendant. The native may pursue foreign spiritual systems, healing in isolation, or emotional rebirth through loss or sacrifice. Rahu's exaggeration seeks transcendence, but Jupiter in the 12th pushes the rebirth inward, toward moksha or reclusive wisdom. If Jupiter were placed instead in the 5th or 10th house, the spiritual teacher archetype may manifest with public recognition and emotional influence. If Ketu is in Punarvasu and Jupiter is placed in the 4th house for Sagittarius ascendant, the native may feel emotionally anchored in inner contentment and spiritual heritage. The combination promotes a sense of purpose through introspection, familial bonds, or ancestral wisdom. Ketu in Punarvasu with a strong Jupiter allows the native to detach from emotional chaos while still nurturing others from a quiet place of inner strength. Finally, if the moon is in Punarvasu for Aries ascendant and rules the 4th house, placed in the 7th house, relationships become central to the theme of emotional revival. The native seeks partnerships that offer peace after storm and often plays the role of healer or nurturer in others' lives. Punarvasu's regenerative light in the House of Unions indicates karmic contracts focused on emotional redemption, spiritual companionship, and restoring balance after broken expectations. Interpretation of Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra. When the moon is placed in Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra and supported by benefics like Jupiter or Venus, it produces a visionary yet intense emotional nature, oriented toward idealism, sacrifice, and mystical transformation. Ruled by Jupiter and symbolized by the twin faces or a two-legged funeral cot, this nakshatra holds the Shakti to uplift and burn through illusion. A benefic moon here fosters emotional depth, idealistic devotion, and a drive to uphold cosmic truth. When afflicted, especially by Rahu, Saturn, or Ketu, it may create emotional extremism, silent suffering, or inner conflict between spiritual longing and material discontent. Venus in Purva Bhadrapada refines spiritual fire into aesthetic expression or intense emotional bonding. When placed in Kendra or Kona and supported by Jupiter or Moon, Venus here creates emotionally charismatic healers, artists, or relationship partners who merge romantic love with spiritual purpose. However, if afflicted, Venus may become self-sacrificing in toxic partnerships, emotionally manipulated by ideals or expressive of suppressed pain through over-romanticism or escapist art. Jupiter in Purva Bhadrapada brings high-minded spirituality, moral conviction, and wisdom of the mystical kind. A strong Jupiter here guides the native through sacred truths, inner philosophy, or healing rituals, making them powerful preachers, mystics, or humanitarians. If afflicted, however, Jupiter's expansive drive may turn into zealotry, emotional detachment cloaked in ethics, or misplaced trust in false spiritual guidance. Mars in Purva Bhadrapada becomes the crusader of ethics, intense, directed, and capable of profound transformation. The native acts with fierce passion toward causes, spiritual activism, or intense self-purification. Mars here fights illusions, but when afflicted, especially by Rahu, it may express as emotional volatility, ideological conflict, or burnout from unattainable ideals. Saturn in Purva Bhadrapada brings emotional gravity and karmic responsibility towards spiritual or societal reform. When well placed, it gives wise, disciplined guides, monks, or elders who silently burn through karmas. Saturn strengthens the inner fire for delayed liberation. When afflicted, Saturn may produce emotional melancholy, suppressed guilt, or a chronic struggle with unworthiness rooted in karmic fears. Rahu in Purva Bhadrapada intensifies the desire for transcendence, fame through spirituality, or mystical power. A supported Rahu gives visionary thinkers, mystic revolutionaries, or speakers who shake up norms through radical compassion or strange truths. When afflicted, Rahu here may cause delusional beliefs, escapism, or emotional detachment masked by spiritual identity. Ketu in Purva Bhadrapada dissolves worldly identity to restore soul awareness. These natives often appear withdrawn, spiritualized, or beyond social roles. When well supported, Ketu grants psychic insight, mastery in metaphysical arts, or detachment from ego battles. If afflicted, however, it may bring emotional numbness, existential fatigue, or a tendency to reject joy out of unconscious guilt. Mercury in Purva Bhadrapada fuses intellectual precision with spiritual symbolism. The native may be a deep speaker, ritualist, or scholar of mystical systems, often skilled in interpreting symbols, metaphors, or esoteric texts. When supported, Mercury here gives eloquent messengers of spiritual truth. When afflicted, especially by Saturn or Rahu, speech may become overly dark, fatalistic, or manipulative, and emotions can be repressed through over-intellectualization. Interpretation of Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra, house placement context. When Jupiter, the ruler of Purva Bhadrapada Nakshatra, is placed in a Kendra, 1st, 4th, 7th, 10th, or Kona, 1st, 5th, 9th, the native's emotional drive for truth, mysticism, and inner transformation gains structure and purpose. For Pisces ascendant, if Jupiter rules the 1st and 10th houses and is placed in the 9th house, and the moon is in Purva Bhadrapada, the person becomes a spiritual leader, philosophical teacher, or mystic educator. Here, the emotional foundation is steeped in idealism and cosmic purpose, and the native often pursues a life of meaning that transcends material success. If Venus is in Purva Bhadrapada and rules the 3rd and 8th houses for Sagittarius ascendant, and is placed in the 5th house, Kona, the native's emotional creativity manifests in deep romantic expressions, spiritual performance, or artistic depth. Venus here turns love into transformation, often drawing people to sacred arts, tantra, or metaphysical beauty. When afflicted, however, the native may face betrayal, secrecy in love, or karmic romantic entanglements tied to past life grief or idealism. When a planet in Purva Bhadrapada has its ruler Jupiter placed in a Dushtana house, 6th, 8th, or 12th, the emotional energies of this nakshatra often carry karmic burdens of sacrifice, solitude, or trials that lead to inner evolution. For instance, if Mercury is in Purva Bhadrapada and rules the 4th and 7th houses for Gemini ascendant, but Jupiter is placed in the 8th house, the native may carry karmic debts through marriage, ancestral secrets, or early emotional instability. Yet, this also offers opportunities for rebirth, healing through speech, or mastery of occult sciences, especially if Mercury is strong. Consider Mars in Purva Bhadrapada for Aries ascendant, ruling the 1st and 8th houses, and placed in the 12th house. The native may be involved in spiritual warfare, secret missions, or inner battles, chasing ideals beyond the visible world. Mars energizes the nakshatra's internal fire, making the person act through self-sacrifice or healing pursuits. If afflicted, it may lead to isolation, hidden enemies, or misdirected anger toward a world that doesn't align with their ideals. If Saturn is in Purva Bhadrapada and rules the 10th and 11th houses for Taurus ascendant and is placed in the 4th house, the native may carry a deep karmic responsibility linked to home, ancestors, or emotional stability. They might be the emotional anchor for their family or community, but feel an inner void. When supported, this Saturn creates quiet reformers, grounded spiritualists, or those who emotionally mature early in life. When afflicted, it may produce emotional detachment, guilt, or the suppression of personal desires for others' sake. Suppose Rahu is in Purva Bhadrapada and Jupiter is in the 6th house for Virgo ascendant. The native may be pulled toward unconventional healing paths, mystic fame, or service that leads to karmic purification. Rahu amplifies Purva Bhadrapada's visionary tendencies, especially in esoteric or taboo fields. If afflicted, this configuration can cause identity confusion, emotional exploitation, or ethical dilemmas. When supported, however, it produces karmic healers or reformers. If Ketu is in Purva Bhadrapada and Jupiter is in the 2nd house for Scorpio ascendant, the native might reject materialism, family conventions, or speech-based validation. The emotional theme is detachment from worldly identity and rediscovery of true inner wealth. This configuration gives meditative thinkers, reclusive scholars, or deeply insightful speakers. When afflicted, however, it can bring struggles with finances, family karma, or speech-related isolation. Finally, if the moon is in Purva Bhadrapada for Aquarius ascendant and rules the 6th house, placed in the 1st house, the native holds an emotionally intense, service-oriented identity. There may be deep inner conviction, a quiet sense of sacrifice, and a tendency to take on others' suffering. If the moon is strong, the person becomes a silent guardian, spiritual practitioner, or emotionally evolved caregiver. If afflicted, this can lead to martyrdom, emotional burnout, or health struggles linked to stress and emotional burden. Interpretation of Vishakha Nakshatra. When the moon is placed in Vishakha Nakshatra and supported by benefics like Jupiter or Venus, it produces a focused, ambitious, and goal-driven emotional temperament. Ruled by Jupiter and co-ruled by Indra and Agni, Vishakha symbolizes the forked branch, indicating the power to choose, to strive, and to transform desire into purposeful action. A benefic moon here grants emotional persistence, charisma, and the ability to channel internal desire into long-term achievements. However, when afflicted by malefics like Rahu, Saturn, or Mars, the moon in Vishakha may exhibit emotional obsession, rivalry, or dissatisfaction despite success. Venus in Vishakha exudes seductive charm, allure, and emotional magnetism combined with high standards. When well placed in Kendra or Kona houses and supported by Jupiter or Mercury, Venus here creates charismatic figures, those who captivate through ambition, beauty, and eloquence. But when afflicted, Venus in Vishakha may result in intense romantic entanglements, possessiveness, or emotional manipulation rooted in hidden insecurity or unmet desires. Jupiter in Vishakha acts as a moral strategist, combining expansion with precision. When well supported, Jupiter brings noble ambition, visionary leadership, and a strong drive for justice or ethical reform. This placement fosters teachers, guides, or political reformers who lead with conviction. However, when afflicted or placed in Dashtana houses, Jupiter in Vishakha may struggle with arrogance, excessive idealism, or dissatisfaction with one's achievements despite public recognition. Mars in Vishakha intensifies competitive willpower. When strong, Mars here produces warriors of purpose, those who strive for success in business, sports, or conflict resolution. Vishakha gives direction to Mars's force, transforming raw energy into focused action. However, if Mars is afflicted, it may generate power struggles, jealousy, or hidden rivalries in relationships or career, particularly when ambition is misdirected or ego-driven. Saturn in Vishakha brings disciplined ambition and delayed but stable success. If placed well, it produces long-term strategists, institutional leaders, or individuals who earn influence through persistence. Saturn aligns Vishakha's desire with structure. However, if afflicted, Saturn may restrict emotional spontaneity, generate bitterness over delayed recognition, or create coldness masked by formality in relationships and partnerships. Rahu in Vishakha exaggerates the desire for recognition, control, or influence. When supported by benefics like Jupiter or Venus, Rahu in Vishakha can create powerful influencers, diplomats, or business magnates who use charm and strategy to rise. However, under affliction, this placement may lead to obsession with validation, image-conscious manipulation, or personal instability behind a polished persona, often resulting in burnout or strained partnerships. Ketu in Vishakha reflects a past life of power, ambition, or unfulfilled desire. In this life, Ketu may make the native internally disillusioned with worldly success, even while being outwardly capable. If well placed, Ketu in Vishakha grants intense spiritual drive, research talent, or mastery over transformation. If afflicted, it may cause emotional fragmentation, detachment from goals, or difficulty in forming lasting partnerships due to internal conflict between desire and renunciation. Mercury in Vishakha combines sharp intellect with persuasive communication. When supported, it creates orators, writers, legal advisors, or strategic consultants who use precise speech to influence others. Vishakha enhances Mercury's focus, making the native calculated yet compelling. When afflicted, especially by Rahu or Mars, Mercury may become argumentative, overly competitive, or manipulative in speech, driven by an underlying fear of inadequacy or the need to win. Interpretation of Vishakha Nakshatra. House placement context. When Jupiter, the ruler of Vishakha Nakshatra, is placed in a Kendra 1st, 4th, 7th, 10th, or Kona 1st, 5th, 9th, Vishakha's intense drive, goal orientation, and moral leadership become focused and impactful. For instance, for Libra ascendant, if Jupiter rules the 3rd and 6th houses and is placed in the 10th house, and Moon is in Vishakha, the native becomes a highly ambitious leader whose emotional resilience and persuasive charisma help them rise through persistent efforts in competitive domains. The nakshatra's forked path energy manifests as strategic decision-making in public life. If Venus is placed in Vishakha and rules the 5th and 10th houses for Capricorn ascendant and is positioned in the 1st house, Kendra, the native expresses Vishakha's power through refined self-presentation, creative leadership, and emotionally engaging charisma. Venus here adds grace to Vishakha's determination, resulting in personalities that charm their way into positions of influence while maintaining high aesthetic or ethical standards. When a Vishakha-linked planet's lord is placed in a Dushtana house, 6th, 8th, or 12th, the nakshatra's ambition and emotional depth may become entangled in karmic pressure, internal rivalry, or obsession with hidden success. For instance, if Mercury is in Vishakha and rules the 1st and 4th houses for Gemini ascendant and is placed in the 8th house, the native may channel their intellectual talents into research, crisis management, or occult disciplines. However, the emotional tone may reflect secrecy, fixation, or competition in private or romantic settings, Vishakha's forked energy becoming an inner tug of war. Now consider Mars in Vishakha for Leo ascendant, ruling the 4th and 9th houses, and placed in the 7th house, Kendra. The native becomes a bold negotiator or partner, someone who thrives on dynamic interactions, business deals, or strategic marriage alliances. Mars in Vishakha lends intensity and magnetism in public or private unions. If Mars is dignified, this can indicate a fearless reformer or entrepreneur. If afflicted, however, the native may struggle with domination in relationships, trust issues, or competitive spousal dynamics. If Saturn is in Vishakha and rules the 5th and 6th houses for Aquarius ascendant and is placed in the 3rd house, the native becomes mentally strong, deliberate in communication, and highly disciplined in executing long-term plans. Vishakha's desire nature is filtered through Saturn's caution, creating focused learners, contract negotiators, or legal minds. If Saturn is afflicted, the person may suffer from pessimism, fear of failure, or overthinking in high-pressure social or professional scenarios. Suppose Rahu is in Vishakha and Jupiter, its nakshatra lord, is placed in the 12th house for Scorpio ascendant. The native may outwardly pursue fame, recognition, or status, yet inwardly feel disconnected from their goals. Vishakha's ambition gets amplified by Rahu, but Jupiter's placement in the 12th suggests emotional detachment, hidden spiritual yearning, or conflict between material drive and soul-level evolution. If well supported, this may produce a public spiritual guide or psychologist. If not, there may be self-sabotage in high-stakes goals. If Ketu is in Vishakha and Jupiter is placed in the 9th house for Aries ascendant, the native may carry karmic memory of past life authority, leadership, or intellectual influence. In this life, they may detach from worldly ambition and seek fulfillment in inner growth, teaching, or non-traditional spiritual paths. Vishakha's intensity becomes focused inward, resulting in a refined ability to guide others beyond ego or achievement. Finally, if the moon is in Vishakha for Taurus ascendant and rules the third house, placed in the 11th house, the native becomes emotionally attuned to social impact, audience engagement, and strategic alliances. This moon supports networking, event leadership, or organizational influence. Vishakha's drive blends with lunar adaptability to create magnetic group influencers. If afflicted, this moon may indicate emotional burnout from peer pressure, rivalry, or the constant need to prove value to society.